Shane Beatty, in association with Riley's SuperValue at the Waterways Salons.
You don't need me to tell you about the Tuam babies story. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. But one group of voices we haven't heard from really are the women, the mothers who were in these mother and baby homes. And women who were in these homes as recently as the early 90s have now called for investigations into other sites where they claim children were buried. This is after the babies' bodies were found at the former home in Tuam. A group called Irish First Mothers has called on the Minister for Children to immediately quantify the number of bodies to end the distressing uncertainty. Kathy McMahon from the group, which represents 60 members, she said their members were very much alive and range in age from the late 70s to the early 40s. Well, I spoke to Kathy earlier and she has been telling me her reaction to the Tuam baby story, but also telling me her own story of being in not one but two mother and baby homes. Have a listen.
I mean, I'm 61 and I'm shocked that I'm encountering women as young as the late 30s who are members of our group who are suffering the same traumatic, post-traumatic stress and other psychological trauma as a result of their experiences. And actually, that is what brings me to tears, is to think that there are young women, younger than my daughters, who are experiencing the same trauma as I am.
And you're in your 60s?
I'm 61.
Now, you obviously felt the need to set up this group a couple of years ago. Before that, was there any support for women like yourself?
There were one or two groups, and they weren't dedicated to mothers. They might be mixed between adopted people, natural mothers and adoptive parents. And I know, and I can't recall the lady's name, but she's been, hammering away for many years on the issue and doing what she could to reach out to people. Like I said, she's also a natural mother. She's based in Dublin. But other groups that were out there were either run by adopted people or they were funded by government and not easy to access as the access that we have now through a Facebook group. And we're not just based on Facebook, but, the access is easier for women now.
Yeah. So did you think that the actual women were the lost voice, that there were groups by the adopted people set up? The government obviously has its own mouthpiece, for want of a better phrase, better terminology, but the actual mothers who were in the homes had no voice.
Yeah, and even when we were members of adoption or groups run by adopted people, our voices were still, we might as well have been shouting into an empty bucket. I witnessed mothers joining groups, posting their story, and there was a big issue where, and I know I went through this myself, where I felt I needed to explain my life away, to explain that I wasn't that woman that other, society maybe had in their heads of what I was like, because we were carrying shame. I mean, the names that, we were called by family members, by nuns, religious orders, priests, that stuck. Those names stuck. So I ended up explaining and trying to, explain my life away and, let people see that, that's not the type of person I was. I witnessed, mothers joining groups and talking or posting about their experiences, and it wasn't going anywhere. So I decided to set up Irish First Mothers as a place where we would have empathy with each other. We did understand, and that's been very successful.
Right. And what was your experience of? Were you in a mother and baby home? Was that the name of where you were?
Well, when back in the 70s, in the early 70s and onwards, My recollection of the title on the homes was Unmarried Mothers' Homes, not mother and baby homes. I was in Dunboyne in 1974 from January to April, and then I was in St. Patrick's on the Navan Road from August to December 1975.
So how old were you then?
I was just gone 18 when I was in Dunboyne, and I was about 2 months off my 20th birthday when I was in St. Patrick's.
And did you know where you were going? Was it explained to you?
No, no, it wasn't actually. And it's only when we're talking to somebody like yourself that we actually, we correct ourselves and we have a memory. No, I wasn't told where I was going. I was delivered to Dunboyne on a dark evening in January. I couldn't see where I was going. When I went into the door of Dunboyne, I was led to a room where I was to sleep. I couldn't see out the window because it was dark, so I had no idea where I was going. I had no idea where I was.
Who put you in that vehicle to go to Dunboyne?
I don't actually remember, but I assume it was my father.
Because you were pregnant?
Because I was pregnant. A family doctor and a local priest advised my father on what to do with a girl in my position.
Yeah.
And that local priest, if you don't mind me naming names, was Father Michael Cleary.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in Ballyfermot, and the local doctor and Father Michael Cleary advised my father on where to put me. When I was delivered to St. Patrick's, and I really don't want to get into who brought me there. I do remember she was as much a victim as I was, and it wasn't my mother. I knew where I was going, but I had other plans. I had plans because I was older. I'd been working. I had saved money. I had redundancy money from the office I'd worked in, and I had plans to go to the UK to my brother,
right,
have my baby there and raise it there. But all of those plans were scuppered because my mother found out.
Mm-hmm. Your plan?
My plan. And she told me in my father's car one day, when my father had left us alone for a few minutes, you're not going to the UK, you're doing what I'm telling you, and the baby's going for adoption.
And you were over 18?
Yeah, I was over 18. But if we're going to get into that, the age of, well, not the age of consent, but the age of majority, it was 21.
Yeah. And
so,
because you see, it's so difficult now for people, lots of people listening will have teenage daughters, and, if the daughter comes home at 18, in some families they will say, oh my God, what are we going to do? But you get on with it. But
yeah.
It seemed so shameful at the time. Did you feel that shame? How did you feel when you had to tell your parents you were pregnant?
Well, I didn't actually tell my parents.
Oh, did you not?
No, I didn't. My mother copped it. I was doing everything I could to conceal my pregnancy. I didn't know what I was going to. On my first pregnancy, I didn't know what I was going to do. I was hoping it would go away. 17 might seem, old today in the sense of, our knowledge and so on. 17 back in 74 was quite innocent.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have access to the internet. We didn't have access to the technology that we have today. And our parents of the older generation were more, I suppose, for the want of a word, controlling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So my mother actually copped it and called the doctor, and I woke up in bed, and there was a doctor. The family doctor was standing beside my bed, and he examined me, and then left the room and told my parents.
And what was that like when they confronted you?
Absolutely, totally scary. It's very hard to describe it, but I find I do it even now. If I'm confronted with some kind of a frightening situation, I go out of my body.
Mm.
So I literally, went out of my body.
And did you know straight away, I will not be allowed to keep this baby, and I have brought shame on the family?
Personally, I didn't feel shame, you know. But I was afraid of the anger. I was afraid of, you know, the anger from my mother in particular, hurting my father. And I didn't worry about neighbours for myself, but I worried for my parents because they were caught up in that. I have a theory, which is that in 1974, we were on the cusp as a society between the fervent religious and the quest for status in society. If you understand what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that it was no longer because of the retribution of God or whatever, but it was now because your status was being damaged. You know, if people knew your daughter was pregnant, you wouldn't be as highly regarded.
Yeah. Well, Enda Kenny spoke about that in the Dáil last week, this gossip, and he was quite emotional saying it about the gossip and the shame on the perceived shame on the family. Can I ask you a question, just in terms of you and dealing with the other women in your group as well? It's been mentioned quite a bit recently, and I'd love to get your take on it. People say, what about the fathers of these babies? Now, you don't have to go into specifics about your own case, but in general, did the fathers of the babies know what was happening?
From my experience and from within the group, and I can't really speak for everybody, but we have a whole array of different experiences in relation to the fathers. And just to say that there are some mothers, and I witnessed some of them in St. Patrick's, who were engaged to be married, who, you know, had, and most of us actually had long-term boyfriends. It wasn't one-night stands.
Yes.
But there were, and there are women and men, husbands and wives out there whose children were taken from them into the mid-90s.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, and they went on, they got married, and they're now reconnecting with their children. Personal experience of that. I have a relative who was an adopted person, and when he searched for his mother, he found his father and three full siblings.
Yes, you do hear of that. That they have their full family is actually together, and they were put up for adoption.
But just another. Can I just go on that a little bit? Just there's also, and in my own experience with my first child's father, I contacted him after, you know, I came back into my body in Dunboyne, and I contacted him and told him where I was. And a week later, a priest arrived at the convent to speak to me, and he was somebody who had contact with the child's father, and he took it upon himself, this priest, to come and tell me that I had ruined my baby's father's life, that I had encouraged him to do what he did, and that my baby was going for adoption because I wasn't going to ruin the young man's future. And on my second daughter, unfortunately, you know, myself and her father dated for several months, and the night I went to tell him I was pregnant, he came to tell me that he'd met somebody else. I did go on to keep my second daughter, but I had a fierce battle in order to keep her. Yes. And I ended up without any supports around me from family or anybody else, except, would you believe it, the nuns. Once they knew that I wasn't going to go under, you know, the pressure wasn't working, and I found a place to live, and it took 6 weeks to find a place to live after my daughter was born, because no landlord in Ireland wanted unmarried mothers in their premises. And once the nuns knew that, you know, I was determined, they gave me a carry-con, they gave me baby clothes.
Right.
And, you know, I have to acknowledge that, you know, that was 1975. There was a struggle, and it was a terrible struggle, coping on £7.50 a week with a child.
Yeah.
The social worker in St. Pat's had no idea about the benefits or assistance that was available to mothers from government. She had to go, inquire about that, because her task was basically, ensuring that adoptions went smoothly.
So, just to be clear, you went to one home, Dunboyne, when you became pregnant with your first baby, and that baby was put up for adoption. Then you left that home, dated a man, became pregnant again, and ended up in another home?
Yes.
And how old were you then?
I was almost 20.
And how did you feel ending up in another home?
Well, I described it to you there. I had no plans to end up in another home. I didn't go to another home. I was delivered. I suppose the second time round I had a little bit more knowledge and I was a bit stronger.
Yeah.
Which enabled me to not give in to the pressures to give my baby for adoption. I raised her myself.
Yeah.
Very, very successfully. I didn't go out planning to become pregnant. There was no access to contraception at the time. Family doctors wouldn't give contraception to, young women, never mind married women, never mind young women.
And tell me, what was life in the both homes you were in? What was day-to-day life like? Because we've heard so much about the tomb babies and people describing it as a living hell. What was your experience of these homes?
Thankfully, physically, it wasn't anything like what the mothers, up to the 70s experienced. There wasn't such physical abuse. There was psychological abuse. There was, that shame. There was, as you can imagine, back then, the religious orders and their attitude towards us fallen women. There was secrecy. We weren't encouraged to befriend each other. Nutritionally, on a Sunday, and it's only, recently I remembered that you might get lamb. But every other day it was, curry sauce on minced meat on a bed of wet rice and porridge for breakfast. Which, it depends on what you were used to before you were dumped or abandoned to the home. My family were a simple family, and my father was educated, self-educated. My mum was an intelligent woman, but we grew up with, porridge for breakfast and, rice and so on. Other people might have found the diet not as nutritious. It wasn't necessarily nutritious.
Yes.
It was whatever kind of kept you alive. Nutrition didn't come into it.
And you had to you were forced, you would say, coerced into giving your first baby up for adoption. Did you have your baby in the hospital or in the home?
I gave birth to my baby, as most mothers did, in Hollis Street Hospital.
In Hollis Street?
When they were in Dunboyne, they were attached to Hollis Street. There was no consultation before. There was no counselling. There was no consultation with legal advice or anything like that. It was just, there was so much shame attached to it. There was no talk about it. And it wasn't that us mothers were ashamed of our babies. It was that society was ashamed of us. But the government and its agents benefited from us, and the convents benefited from us. I'm not into pointing the fingers just at the religious orders. The government paid the convents to conceal us mothers and to take our babies. And because the government didn't want to have to deal with, they didn't want to have to deal with mothers and their infants.
Yeah. And when, Kathy, you gave birth, how long did you get with your baby before, was it a boy or a girl, was put up for adoption, or what happened?
My daughter was born in April, And I nursed her for 7 days in Hollis Street. And on the 7th day, I was being discharged. I was told to dress my baby. I knitted clothes for her. I dressed her up. A relative who'd been sent to pick me up to bring me home held my baby as I was getting dressed. And I turned around and a nurse was walking out of the room with my baby. And I asked my relative, where is she going? And I was told, she's gone.
So you didn't get to say goodbye?
No. And that's why I'm calling, and our group, and the majority of people, we called for it 3 years ago. We did not welcome the terms of reference of the Commission of Inquiry into Mother and Baby Homes. We were the only group who didn't welcome it in some form or other. We had huge reservations because, you see, women weren't only, abandoned to concentration convents. Women were locked up in their family homes, in private nursing homes, in mental hospitals and other hospitals. Women, so by the terms of reference covering initially only 14 homes, it was, there was 2/3 of the women who were affected by all of this were written out of the Commission.
Right. And Cathy, just to ask you about, because Tuam is in the headlines at the moment, and the fact that they say 800 bodies, babies' bodies and toddlers' bodies found in these underground chambers. Do you have a suspicion, and would you like more mother and baby homes to be investigated, that this happened in other homes?
Absolutely. I think that the grounds of other homes, particularly where babies were born on site, need to be examined. There are, mothers who do have recollections of graves and burial areas.
How do you feel about the Catholic Church in Ireland now?
I think it's horrendous, the influence that they had on people. We have actually requested for the Attorney General to look at the whole genocide issue in relation to the discovery over in Tuam and whatever else might be found, dug up. I don't mean that. Whatever else might be found. Yeah. So, we would like basically an answer from the Attorney General in response to a letter that we sent for consideration under the Genocide Act of 1973. How do I feel about the Catholic Church now? I don't. I'm not anti-religion as such. It wasn't only the church. Governments actually encourage this too. And what I say is that government and state and church worked in symbiosis with each other. They were like viruses, feeding off each other. And then the people, the vulnerable people who actually needed protection, ended up being used by them. I use the word that us mothers and our children were used as commodities, not only by the church, but also by the state.
Yeah. Can I ask you finally, because I think a lot of people will struggle with getting their head around this. How do you feel about your parents now? Can you understand why they did it, or would you ever understand why they would have wanted to send you and the other parents sending their children to these homes?
What I say is that whatever about what happened all those years ago, up to the 90s, we're not talking about anything really historical here. Whatever about what happened back then, and whatever about people's ignorance or people's, being led and said by the church. Today, there is no reason why people cannot sit down and talk. I said this back in 1995 to my own mother. I was involved in a car accident in 1995 in which my third son died. And at that time, when I would ring my parents, there was an excuse, and I'm not saying this with any animosity towards them. Yeah. It's just the reality. When I'd ring and my dad would answer the phone, he'd say my mum was sick, and when I'd ring and speak to my mum, she'd say my dad was sick. And there was one day I rang and my mum said, your dad isn't well. And I said, why, what's wrong with him? Now, this is after my son is dead. And I said, why, what's wrong with him? And I'm feeling at the same time it's disrespectful to really kind of ask that. And my mum said, oh, he's a bit depressed. She said, there's questions that he had about his childhood that were never answered, and there's nobody now to answer them. And I said, well, ma'am, that's why I think we should all be sitting around talking without judgment, without animosity, without pointing the finger, that we should all be able to talk, because otherwise we're going to end up just like Dad, suffering depression because there was nobody left to talk to. We need answers. We need answers from the church, the state, and in particular, in order to mend the bond, we need answers from our family. Not even answers. We need to be able to talk about this. And I'm going to say something that I've never said to anybody really before. But as I speak about my experiences, I'm not speaking about this to get back at anybody or to hurt anybody, but I've got a right to tell my story. But when I do speak about my story, I am further ostracised from my family or ignored by my family until they come to terms. You see, there's a guilt out there, and guilt is horrendous. I have no regrets on my life, but there are people out there who are suffering guilt because they had been encouraged and enticed into doing what they did with their daughters, with their sisters, or whoever, and their grandchildren. And they are suffering such guilt that in fact what they're doing is causing more hurt, digging the dagger in deeper. Because we're not talking because we're judging people. Particularly we're not judging our families. Our families were as much victims at times as we were. We're talking because we want truth. We want to heal. And we want justice.
And that was Kathy McMahon of Irish First Mothers speaking to me a little earlier. On the way, Dara Fitzpatrick will mark your card for day one of Cheltenham.
Have you a headache with your rent property?
Nace Property Management provides a professional, hassle-free service and advice. For total peace of mind, Nace Property Management. nacepm.ie.
My name's Una. I've gone through some really tough times in my life. The hardest thing is to go